Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is when you're watching or listening to this podcast. I'm your host, Paul Weaver. On today's episode, it's a pleasure to have back on the program Dr. Tom Woodward to continue our discussion on the bankrupt view known as Darwinism. If you've not listened to the first part of this two-part podcast series, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that first part first, as today's episode will be building upon that one. We're glad to have back on the program Dr. Woodward, who is a fellow of the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington. He has spoken in over 80 universities and in 40 countries. He has been the research professor at Trinity College of Florida, and he led the C.S. Lewis Society that was established at Princeton University, but was later moved to the Trinity College campus in 1990. Dr. Woodward is the author of Doubts About Darwin, which Christianity Today gave the Honor of the Book of the Year award in 2004 in the category of contemporary issues. Dr. Woodward is also the author of Darwin Strikes Back, and his most recent book is entitled The Mysterious Epigenome, subtitled What Lies Beyond DNA. Please join me and listen and watch with me our previously recorded program. Well, Dr. Woodward, in your sequel, Darwin Strikes Back, also available, it's available on Amazon, you continued to develop further the spread of those cracks in Darwin's foundation. You write about 5 branches of evidence, but for our purposes, it would be great if you would discuss one of those, specifically the fossil record that is embarrassing for Darwinianism. So please update us on the explosion of evidence that the fossil record provides.
Sure, if I can reach to the shelf behind me, so I can show my ammonite. I don't know if you can see this.
So those who are listening, you'll want to jump on our YouTube channel to see this illustration here.
Yeah. Well, the ammonite that I have in front of me is a spectacular example of design, and I have both what's called the part and the counterpart. You can see the kind of the concave depression in the rock where it was sitting, and ammonites popped into the fossil record, and I'm just going to use the standard dating. I don't buy that dating necessarily, but some 450 million years ago, not quite as far back as the Cambrian, but we also have in my office a bunch of fossils from the Cambrian explosion. And the amazing thing is that the leftovers, the surviving hard parts, whether it's shells or teeth or bones or other parts of an animal or plant for that matter, those surviving imprints in rock, or sometimes they're found embedded in fossilized amber, drops, from a tree that fossilize. The resin turns hard, and you'll find little insects even imprisoned in amber. And they found whole animals. I mean, actually salamanders covered in the inside the amber blob of resin. So a tree sap that has solidified. So all these fossils represent a snapshot looking back in time, and we can compare them and we can see if the proposed slow, gradual development of animals and plants over time, whether those are actually seen coming together across the strata. If you go from this level to this level to this level, do we see that developmental pathway? Do we see any kind of in-between forms? If we say that, for example, this animal A, let's say a cow, evolved eventually into a whale. After all, whales are mammals, and they would have had to evolve from land back into the sea. Well, that's interesting. You'd have to have a lot of intermediate forms connecting them. So you can ask the question, how often are we finding intermediate forms? And the answer is virtually never. And the one thing about intermediate or transitional forms is that if you do think you're finding something, check it out first. Get it tested by all the other people who know what they're doing. And so I would say one of the most exciting things about the fossil record is that you see all these kinds of plants and animals. The classifications are different between plants and animals, but in the animal kingdom, there are huge categories called phyla, or a singular one of them is a phylum. And within the evolutionary, if you want to call it evolutionary history, if there was any, there has been amazingly zero transitional forms from one phylum to another. That is the shocker of the millennium. Because if Darwinian theory were even close to accurate description of reality, you would find dozens or maybe hundreds or thousands of transitional forms leading from one major group to another. And the fact that the lowest level of rock, like down at the bottom level of the Grand Canyon, has zero connectivity in the fossils between the major groups, the phyla, it's over. I mean, the theory is dead on arrival, and that's all I can say in a quick summary. But I think the book by Steve Meyer called Darwin's Doubt is required reading, or if you don't have time to tackle that whole book, you can just watch the 1 hour documentary called Darwin's Dilemma, produced by Illustra Media. It gives kind of the major thrust of the book by Steve Meyer, Darwin's Doubt. It's an amazing development to see how the theory of evolution is actually completely turned upside down. It is overthrown by the fossil record.
Do you know online a place that people can go to find that documentary?
Yes, I think if you go to YouTube, if you just put in Darwin's Dilemma, and you can actually find Steve Meyer lecturing also, and there's no charge for these.
Well, regarding the fossil record and the embarrassment that it has caused for Darwinianism, you've urged Christians to memorize, and you frequently use two key terms that were coined by Harvard professor Stephen Gould. Would you explain?
Yes, so we're fortunate that even though he's not with us any longer, Stephen Jay Gould died, I think, in his early 60s of cancer. This is probably somewhere around 2003. But he wrote many, many books. He would write a monthly essay for Natural History magazine, and those essays were gathered and published about every other year as a new best-selling book on fossils, basically. Gould was a professor of geology at Harvard University, and he was also one of the curators at the U.S. Top museum in this area, at least one of the top three, and it's the Museum of Natural History in Manhattan in New York City. And so Gould, with his partner Eldridge, put together a theory to deal with the sudden appearance of new form. For example, if the ammonite appears suddenly, and let's just pick a year of 487 million years ago, and it doesn't have any ancestral linkage to other form that even remotely looks like it. It just ta-da, poof of smoke, and there it is. And that's called sudden appearance. That's the first term. And sometimes you hear it used abrupt appearance. It means the same thing. Well, if you go along each strata after that and look for ammonites, the question is, what do you find? And if it stays the same, level by level by level, never changes, it just doggedly resists change. We call that stasis. So stasis is the term, STASIS. And for example, I go to Red Lobster and I always like to order rainbow trout. I'm the same. I never change. I have menu stasis. Okay, I resist change. Well, if we see throughout the fossil record the phenomenon of stasis, animals, once they appear out of nowhere, never change, how does that match with Darwinian theory? The answer is it's the dead opposite. It's the direct opposite of Darwinian theory, where new things are gradually, slowly, step by tiny step developing. So I encourage people to just memorize the phenomena. And this was brought out by people who are trying to rescue Darwinism by developing a sudden change. They said, well, it's not a ramp. It's like a stair step. But they stay the same, stay the same, stay the same. Boop, suddenly they evolve into a new form. Like a mama lizard lays an egg and out pops a baby bird. That's like the equivalent of an atheist miracle, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
genetic equipment of that lizard, mama lizard, are devoted 100% to producing another lizard.
Hmm.
So, but they came up with this theory. It's fallen by the wayside at this point, but
Hmm.
it was an interesting. But the most interesting thing is what drove that theory was the secret that had been kept behind closed doors for 40 or 50 years until basically the year 1972, when they began to write openly about the thing that they were only whispering behind closed doors,
Hmm.
that there is no evidence of gradual change. There's sudden appearance followed by stasis. And I
Hmm.
think Christians can just say to their friends, once they study this a little bit, I write about it in our book on my chapter on fossils in Darwin Strikes Back. I think it's chapter 7. And once we understand this, we can go to our atheist friends or professor, even a teacher, and say, how do you explain abrupt appearance followed by stasis? And
Hmm.
many times I've had people say to me, what do you mean by that? And at that point, I have an opportunity. They've asked me the question. I need to
Yeah.
answer it. And now I'm sharing with my doggedly convinced evolutionary friend the evidence against his theory.
Hmm.
And he's asked me to give it to him.
Yeah. Well, continuing along this line of the embarrassing fossil record, please share with us an exciting discovery by a German paleontologist named Gunter. I'll let you give the last name. Who is he? Gunter.
Gunther, yeah, that's the way I think he pronounces his name. Gunter, Gunther Beckley.
Okay.
Bechly. And I believe that's a name that we should all jot down and type into our search engine, or to, let's say, not just Google, but maybe YouTube or Vimeo. And because in the excellent film on Michael Behe, we'll talk about him in our follow-up podcast on
Hmm.
intelligent design. Michael Behe has an excellent 1 hour documentary called Revolutionary. So here's a little commercial. Go to again, your YouTube search bar and type in revolutionary and then Behe, Behe. And as you follow that, you'll see that Behe's book impacted a German paleontologist who had just was taking down a display. This is about 15 years ago. And one of the display things was Darwin's Origin of Species. And the scale of that one book was heavier than these 6 intelligent design books. So that was the up end of the scale. Darwin's book was the heavier. So that was the display case honoring Darwin in the bicentennial. And as he was taking down these books, Beckley said, never read any of these. My friends tell me they're worthless, but hey, there's one by Behe, Darwin's Black Box. Maybe I'll read it. And in that video, Revolutionary, Behe, his story is told that when Beckley comes in about 30, 40 minutes into the presentation, he says, I read this book and it was very important and it wasn't anything like I thought it would. I won't try to mimic his German accent. But he basically says it was very well written, very well argued, based on the best evidence. And because of that one book, I began to think maybe there was something to the other side after all. So he said, I began to reach out to the scientists of intelligent design, and they began to interact with me. And after 5 years of reading and research, I decided that they were right.
Hmm.
And then eventually, after that, he became a Christian as well.
Hmm.
And Beckley is probably the most, I mean, he's like the Apostle Paul. So there were always the 12 disciples, and then God says, okay, I'm going to bring this superstar in to help you. He brings in Apostle Paul. Beckley is like our Apostle Paul.
Hmm. Neat. So he went from Darwinian atheist to intelligent design to then Christian. So intelligent design was his stepping stone.
Yeah, exactly. And he was an evolutionary biologist. He was a paleontologist, an expert on fossil dragonflies. He
Hmm.
had his own page in Wikipedia. But after he became public in, I think, 2018, that he was now in his thinking was lined up, he was shown the door at the Stuttgart Museum of Natural History, where his office had been for 20 years. And he basically, his Wikipedia page was deleted. He was basically erased. And I'm
Yeah.
thinking, if that's the way Darwinian scholarship is going to operate, well, let it be brought into public glare. That's
Yeah.
horrific.
Yeah. Well, I remember that old documentary, well, not too old, but maybe 15 years ago, I don't know, Expelled, right? That with a little humor to it, but it was documenting people being kicked out of their tenured professors, right?
No, Expelled is required watching. It's about an hour and a half. I showed it every year in my intelligent design course. It's
Hmm.
extremely well done.
And I say it's humorous because you have a comedian. What's his last name? That was the moderator, Stein, right?
Yeah, the famous Ferris
That's
Bueller's Day Off. He's
right.
the teacher who says Bueller,
Yeah.
Bueller.
Yeah. So it's entertaining, but it's also very informative, isn't
It's
it?
very informative. It's spectacular. Yeah, very well done.
Well, you have given our listeners and viewers a lot of good arguments, but also some good research to be done and some homework to good sources to follow up on. So that's good. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Well, another topic covered in Darwin Strikes Back is the work of Jonathan Wells, as he shows and now I'm stating in quotes, quoting, icons of evolution. Are just that mere pictures or diagrams that dazzle the eyes, but have virtually no real evidence behind them. Can you explain this area that seems like a death knell for Darwin?
Sure. No, I think it is another death knell for Darwinian theory. The original book came out about the year 2000, and it caused a furor across the scientific world. I mean, you talk about taking a baseball club or a baseball bat and just hitting a beehive.
Hmm.
What do the bees do? They come out with their stingers ready to zap you. And that's what this professor, who by the way had a double doctorate, got his first doctorate. He actually went to Princeton before he was brought into the army. Then he went to Yale University for a PhD in the history of this whole area of evolution. Then he went to Berkeley for a second doctorate in cell biology and genetics. So he ain't no dumb guy. I mean, he's about as smart as they get. But when he became a doubter of Darwin, he began to look at the textbooks, both at high school but especially college level as well, and noticing the way they were trying to convince students. And often there'd be a picture, like embryos showing kind of an evolutionary stage inside the womb. These were fudged, faked, fraudulent drawings by a German embryologist, Ernst Haeckel. And Haeckel in the late 1800s was actually reprimanded by his fellow scientists for doing this fakery.
Hmm.
But those same drawings are then used in scientific textbooks, high school textbooks, year after year. I even brought those drawings in. My dad, who had gone to Princeton, showed me his book, and I was a pro evolution. I was like a cheerleader for Darwin at that point in high school, and I brought those same Haeckel embryo drawings to my class. And he shows why that they should never be used. He also shows why the peppered moth resting on the tree trunks, that never really was validated scientifically. And actually, they just took dead moths and pasted them on tree trunks and took a picture. They didn't actually capture them, doing. And even if the peppered moth story, and I don't have time to go into that, but the idea of the peppered moth is that the background color of the tree determines which are eaten or not eaten, and if the tree is dark, then the dark peppered moths survive, and the opposite with the light peppered moths, obviously. And so, but that only shows or would show microevolution, just the change of wing color. You're not developing any new structure. But the funny thing is that those observations have now crashed and burned. But they're still in the textbook. The story is still being told in the textbook. And he goes on with many, 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 many other, a total of 10 actually, of these pictures or diagrams that are used to convince, and all of them are filled with fraudulent and sometimes just outlandishly inaccurate information.
So you discuss that in your book, Darwin Strikes Back, but you're speaking of Dr. Jonathan Wells, who wrote this or documents this in Icons of Evolution, right? That's the name of his book.
That's the name of the book, yeah. And there's actually a very good video on YouTube, which is also called Icons of Evolution. It covers about half of the book.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, Dr. Wells has also published a follow-up book entitled Zombie Science, which expands this critique of Darwin. Can you give us a quick glimpse of that?
Yeah, what do you call science, which is basically dead on arrival, has no sort of supporting science, and yet it's still walking around terrorizing people? It's zombie science.
Huh.
So in Zombie Science, it's a shorter volume, and it's like a follow-up. Just came out a few years ago, and it's brilliant. It's available on Amazon. But Zombie Science, he actually adds a few other of these icons that have been brought in to kind of shore up the case, because those 10 icons are really collapsing. And in the new volume, it's really funny. Someone has commented that the original icons of evolution showed that evolution was basically, naked. It had no valid, data behind it. And the new book shows it doesn't even have a pulse anymore. Well, what he's showing is that the people who are responsible for crafting and checking those textbooks have not consistently responded when they're shown these errors. They basically turned the other way and said, "Who cares?" And so it's a sad day for science education. But I think that the more that Christian parents or any parents, what they may be like I was, an advocate, strong advocate I was, of course, Darwinian theory and teaching of evolution. I think that we should still teach evolution. We should teach about evolution, and we should teach about the problems with evolution. That's the problem, that we don't even bring out the problems with evolution in many public high school science classrooms.
So you're saying in our junior highs and high school textbooks all around the United States, they still have these icons of evolution, the zombie science.
They are often, the majority of them are still there, and the cleanup has never really taken place in any serious way. I mean, bits here and there have been changed, but by and large, it's about as bad as it was back in year 2000, some 22 years ago, 23 years ago.
Well, even though we'll cover intelligent design in another program, you often say that DNA and complex machines, which we've discussed already in the cell, complex machines are part of our slam dunk against Darwinism. Would you please tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, and when we do that, other podcasts, I will have a little model. We in our DNAandbeyond.org is our website. If anybody would like to visit there, DNA and spell out the word "and." It's like Bed Bath and Beyond. Okay, but this is DNAandbeyond.org. We actually have a 38-inch model that we use to show the beauty and the complexity, but specifically the programming, the computer-like programming that we find in DNA, which is not just like a message, like what we call in communication theory, semiotic, sign-based communication. It is exactly identical to a computer code. In fact, many scientists, the top engineers and scientists in computing and computational engineering have said that the closest thing to a computer code in the world of biology is the DNA and the sister code of RNA. And those two codes together turn the third code, which is protein, is the final output of those DNA and RNA codes. Well, in our experience, we never see code, digital computer-like code, coming from forces of nature. It's like if I were to take you, Paul, down to the Clearwater Beach. Okay, we just moved away from Clearwater, but we were back there a few weeks ago. Yeah, it's a glorious beach, beautiful, beautiful. And if I took you out there and let's just say we saw a big heart drawn in the sand, and then John loves Mary, and you say, oh, and you might look at it and say, okay, I wonder who John and Mary are. Maybe they're here. And then I would say, oh, no, that wasn't formed by John or Mary or one of their friends, trying to maybe get them to be interested in each other. That was done by the waves. Some waves hit the beach with bits of shell and some little pebbles, and that inscribed it. Well, the chance of that theory, my wave theory, being true is about the same chance that forces of nature could form the minimum genome size of about 480,000 nucleotide pairs, which we now know you need at least about 480 genes to run a cell. And that computes, if you do the math, to about 480,000 letters of DNA. So we're talking about half of a megabyte of information is the threshold for a functioning, barely existing cell. So to me, the evidence of just the DNA computational programming in every living thing, and of course humans, it jumps beyond 500 genes. We have 20,000 genes. And if you do the math of what random interaction and jostling of pre-existing genes can do in producing new genes, I mean, you can't even develop a single gene in the last 50 years of biological research through Darwinian processes. It just can't happen. Hasn't happened, and it can't happen. So to me, that's kind of like maybe a sneak preview of what I'd like to share when we're together on the other time, the other podcast. So, I mean, God is shouting design from this amazing signature He's left in every one of our cells.
Nice. And of course, Paul makes that argument too, doesn't he, in the book of Romans? Creation calls out for a creator, right?
Absolutely.
Well, Dr. Woodward, would you tell us more about a ministry event you lead called DNA and Beyond? You've discussed a little bit about it already, but what is that all about? And tell us about your three-dimensional approach, speaking of stars, fossils, and DNA.
Sure. So DNA and Beyond is now a branch of the larger entity, which is called Apologetics Incorporated. We flipped the name from C.S. Lewis Society to Apologetics Inc., I-N-C, period. Our website is apologetics.org. Anybody who wants to visit, I think you would enjoy it. Love to have you. So the DNA and Beyond sliver of the pie is where we're developing what we call Follow the Science. It's a program where students, teachers, just ordinary followers of Christ, the people who love the Lord, and it can be anywhere in the world. We really would like to establish this movement in about 30 countries by the end of this year. And we're basically offering through scholarships that have already been donated our DNA model at about 1/5 of the normal cost. So literally about the cost of maybe a meal if you go to Outback, and that same cost would be available, and then you can add on a couple of fossils. And we actually have at no extra charge 3 of these blow-up balloons. We have a black balloon with a pattern of galaxies on it, so you can actually demonstrate the universe expanding over time by blowing up the universe. And some people say, what? You're going to blow up the universe? Better be careful. But we have developed this as a series of down to earth, put them on the table demos. And when we go to McDonald's and put some of these items out, it is just amazing. Or go to a shop, Starbucks, any coffee shop. Usually within 5 minutes, people will come over and engage in conversation, and we can easily bring in the design aspect. And just say, have you heard what they've discovered about the computer-like code in DNA? By the way, have you heard about the 9 verses in the Old Testament that describe the expansion of the universe? And this is something that modern science has just confirmed. It's like the science is catching up with the Bible. and on and on. And we talk about the sudden appearance and stasis, of the fossils, and invite people to read the Book of John, or well, it's just a kind of a way to share. And we've actually developed ATCG, the four letters of DNA: adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine. ATCG is Adam, created perfect for fellowship with God. T, temptation, the fall of Adam, and we're in that downward spiral. C is Christ, the second Adam, paid for our sins on the cross. And G is grace. God says, all who turn to me will be saved by the grace of God. So ATCG, the 4 points of the gospel we've developed. And so we're trying to get the word out and maybe really inspire people to use science as a kind of an on-ramp, a bridge to present Christ and Christianity.
In my introduction, I mentioned that you've spoken at 80 different universities, and probably over 80, and 40 different countries. If someone's listening, watching, is involved in a university or a ministry or a church would like to have you, are you still traveling and teaching, and how can they be in touch?
My title, it was for about 34 years, it was president and executive director. Now I'm senior lecturer, which means I get to lecture, I get to speak, and I'm working on an Old Testament survey book, which hopefully will finish by the first of next month, and I'm working on a new edition of the Mysterious Epigenome for the Discovery Institute. They're going to bring out a revised edition. So thank you for asking me about those opportunities. I'd love to, compare notes and see how I can help anybody anywhere.
Dr. Woodward, you often give lectures on these topics, but you also stress the witness of other aspects of creation also, such as beauty or wonder or the mockingbird effect. Can you elaborate on these?
Okay, well, yeah, let me just mention, what do I mean by mockingbird effect? About 7 or 8 years ago, as I was going to my back porch, and we have some Cocker Spaniels, so we would let them out in the morning, and they're romping around the backyard, and we would have this mockingbird, which I think is the state bird of Florida, and he would sit up there creating this endless series of clever, almost like divinely inspired little calls. I mean, talk about somebody who's strutting his stuff. I feel like saying to the mockingbird, "You're one of a kind." I mean, you are so equipped by God to just invent new songs, and they come nonstop. It's like, how did God gear his brain to do that? So I always smile. I can't help just smiling so widely, when I hear a mockingbird sing in the morning, and we have one up here who's just started in our area. And so to me, just the experience of the beauty of nature slaps you almost in the face and says, wake up, literally smell the roses, but observe the roses and all the other flowers and all the other flittering birds and rumbling mammals and slithering snakes or whatever. See the creation. It's just God went overboard. That the word overboard doesn't even come close to capturing it. Overboard times trillions and trillions and trillions of overboards. And to me, it's like the C.S. Lewis argument of joy, that zingzu, the sense of, you sense just without even having any intellectual argument that God is so overwhelmingly real that this experience I'm having could not be rooted in mere atomic, interactions. And so I think that one of the great, great takeaways from science and nature is that God is at every level, even at deep intuitive levels, reaching out to all the people because he loves us that much and invites us into a relationship forever and ever. All you can say is, wow, it's so wonderful. That's the mockingbird effect.
Nice. Wow. Well, that's a wonderful way to wrap up our podcast today. Thank you, Dr. Woodward, for bringing your expertise and knowledge in the subject of Darwinism and your life story of being a convert from Darwinism to intelligent design. Look forward to our next conversation. Well, our time is up for today's episode on Darwinism. If it was of interest to you and helped you, I'd like to encourage you to acquire your own copy of Dr. Woodward's books. Again, they are Doubts About Darwin, Darwin Strikes Back, and The Mysterious Epigenome, subtitled What Lies Beyond DNA. In our next episode, Dr. Woodward will return to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast to discuss intelligent design. You won't want to miss it. And if you're a regular listener to this podcast, you know that international missions and leadership development is very near to my heart. I can't think of a more strategic way to make an eternal impact on an entire country than by training its Christian leaders for the work of the ministry. And that's why I'm pleased to partner with the National Theological College and Graduate School as a volunteer professor of Bible and Theology and board member. NTCGS is a strategically placed college and graduate school with 3 campuses in the Middle East and 1 in East Africa. We're training Egyptians, Jordanians, Syrians, Lebanese, and East Africans in the Scriptures. If you'd like to join me in partnering with NTCGS through your prayers or your giving, please go to ntcgs.org. That's ntcgs.org. Thank you so much for your consideration. Well, I hope you'll join Dr. Woodward and me again for our next episode. But until next time, never forget, Bible and theology matters, because what you really believe determines how you really behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.